Shocking photo of a forgotten woman in Mielchotsun. As a historian specializing in the social movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the often overlooked contributions of women, she spent her days sifting through the detritus of history. Her office, a meticulously organized haven of archival boxes and digital screens, was usually her primary battlefield. But today, her sanctuary was not the hushed halls of a university archive, but the chaotic, dusty aisles of Antiquarian's Lament, a sprawling antique shop known for its eclectic and uncatalogued collection. She was on the hunt for early suffrage pamphlets, a niche interest that rarely yielded abundant fruit, but always offered the thrilling prospect of discovery. The proprietor, a stoic man named Mr. Abernathy, knew Evelyn by sight and allowed her free rein amongst his piled treasures, trusting her discerning eye not to disrupt the precarious stacks. It was tucked away in a brittle, leather-bound photo album, nestled between sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced gentlemen and smiling children, that Evelyn found her. The album, haphazardly labeled Miscellaneous Newstead, held little initial promise. Most of his year's contents were typical as studio shots, formal and posed, capturing the static essence of a bygone era. There were stiff family groupings, solemn children in their Sunday best, and couples staring awkwardly into the lens, their expressions fixed by the long exposure times. Evelina Villas-Bourne dismissed it entirely, moving on to a stack of old magazines, when something made her pause. A corner of a photograph, peeking from a slightly askew page, seemed to radiate a different energy. On the third-to-last page, secured by delicate feathered corner tabs, was an image that seized Evelyn's attention with an almost physical force. It was a photograph roughly 5 by 7 inches, printed on thick, slightly curled albumen paper. The quality of the print was surprisingly good for its age, suggesting a careful hand in its development. The date, faintly inscribed in elegant script on the back, read simply, 1820. The subject was a woman, no older than her late 20s, perhaps early 30s. Her hair, dark and pulled back severely, perhaps in a simple chignon or bonne, framed a face that was strikingly beautiful yet imbued with an intensity that defied the era's demure expectations. She wasn't smiling, in fact. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor at the corner of her lips, suggesting either suppressed emotion or a challenge in resolve. It wasn't the forced, placid expression common in portraits of the time, but something far more alive. But it was her eyes that held Evelyn captive. They were dark, deep-set, and fixed directly on the camera with an unnerving frankness. There was no coyness, no practiced modesty, just a raw, unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through the 100+ years separating them. It was a look of intelligence, wariness, and an underlying fire. What truly set the photograph apart, however, was not just the woman's arresting presence, but her attire and the subtle details of her surroundings. She was dressed in practical, dark clothing, perhaps a simple blouse and skirt, rather than the elaborate corsetry, voluminous skirts, and decorative lace typical of the period's formal portraits. Her hands, resting on what appeared to be a worn wooden table, were unadorned, strong and capable, not daintily folded or holding a prop like a fan. In the background, barely visible in the soft focus, were what looked like stacks of books or pamphlets, haphazardly arranged, and a rudimentary printing press, its heavy iron frame partially obscured but undeniably present. This was no ordinary society lady posing for her annual portrait. This woman was different. There was a defiance, a silent play, or perhaps a challenge emanating from her image. Evelyn, accustomed to the staged performances of 19th-century photography, immediately recognized the anomaly. The shocking element wasn't grotesque or scandalous in the conventional sense, but rather the sheer, unbridled force of her personality, so starkly captured in an age that often sought to flatten and constrained female expression. It was the shock of recognition of encountering a spirit that refused to be confined. Even in a two-dimensional representation, this woman seemed to leap off the page, demanding attention, demanding to be understood. Forgotten, Evelyn mused aloud, her finger tracing the faded edges of the print. The album offered no name, no location beyond Newstead, a small, rather unremarkable town nestled in the foothills of upstate New York. It was a place Evelyn knew primarily from historical maps, a blink-and-you-miss-it dot on the way to more significant industrial centers, historically known for its textile mills. Why would such a powerful presence be relegated to an anonymous album in a forgotten shop? Who was she? What was her story? And why Evelyn felt with a growing certainty had it been so completely erased from any visible record? A peculiar sense of mission settled over Evelyn. It wasn't merely academic curiosity. It was an almost visceral call to action. This woman's gaze, intense and unflinching, demanded to be seen, to be known, to have her existence acknowledged beyond this single, haunting image. Evelyn felt an ethical imperative, a historian's duty, to exhume this forgotten life from the archives of obscurity. The thought of this powerful woman, remaining forever nameless, her story untold, was simply unacceptable. She purchased the album, though her heart was set solely on that one photograph, feeling a profound responsibility to the woman who stared back at her from across the chasm of time. She held this album carefully as she left the shop, the weight of it feeling disproportionately heavy, laden with the untold story of the woman from when Evelyn knew, with a clarity that bordered on obsession, that she had to discover who she was. Her ongoing research into the early suffrage movement would have to wait. A new, far more compelling quest had just begun, one that promised not just academic insight, but a profound human connection. Back in the meticulously organized chaos of her home office, filled with stacks of books and the hum of her computer, Evelyn carefully extracted the photograph from its brittle tabs. The reverse side, as she'd noted in the shop, bore only Tiocho nan inte and the faint, almost illegible inscription, Banse. The clarity of the photograph itself suggested a professional studio, yet there was no photographer's mark, no embossed name or address, which was highly unusual for the period. Most commercial studios proudly stamped their work. Its absence suggested either a lesser-known local photographer, perhaps a nascent amateur, or a deliberate attempt to obscure its origin or the subject's association with it. The faint presence of the printing press in the background further hinted that this wasn't a standard studio portrait. Evelyn started her investigation, where all good historical detectives do too, with the sparse clues she possessed. Banse, Newstead, Wantes Dormenta. Newstead was a ghost town, essentially, its population dwindling significantly after the local mill closed in the... Most of its original record could be scattered, if they existed at all, likely residing in regional historical societies, or even private collections. Her initial searches were frustrating. Online genealogical databases yielded dozens of Banses across New York State in the late 19th century, but none with a clear connection to Newstead or any distinguishing markers that matched the fierce spirit in the photograph. Census records for Newstead from the earliest house Iotinben Fenetentiasendo showed a few Benz families, but no obvious candidate matching the woman's age or distinctive character. Their occupations were largely agricultural or mill-related, offering no hint of the intellectual pursuits Evelyn suspected. She checked newspaper archives for Newstead, a local weekly, the Newstead Chronicle, digitized through a university library consortium. For weeks, she scoured issues from Nino, searching for any mention of an Banse, or for news of local photographic studios, or even anything related to women's groups or unusual public events. It was a tedious process, page by virtual page, often feeling like sifting through sand for a single grain of gold. The Chronicle was a treasure trove of small-town gossip and mundane local news, harvest reports, church socials, minor crimes, and endless advertisements for dubious patent medicines. It painted a vivid, if often dull, picture of life in a rural New York town. There was, however, a recurring undercurrent of social commentary. The late 1880s and early 1890s were a period of significant social upheaval, even in quiet towns. The temperance movement was strong, advocating for the prohibition of alcohol. Labor disputes simmering in industrial centers, occasionally echoing in local papers, and the nascent women's suffrage movement was beginning to gain traction, albeit slowly, even in conservative rural areas. Evelyn found several editorials in the Chronicle decrying the radical notions brought by accusators from the one particularly scathing piece from the summer of 1890 railed against certain female elements who sought to disrupt the natural order and abandon their domestic duties for public spectacle. The language was alarmist, depicting these women as threats to home and hearth. It was vague, providing no names, but it became soon terrorist. Within Beatrice was Eleanor Vance, one of these female elements, against whom the local establishment railed. The photograph certainly suggested a woman who was not afraid to challenge norms, whose presence alone felt like a disruption. Driven by this slim lead, Evelyn expanded the search. She looked for records of women's clubs, temperance societies, or any form of civic engagement in Newstead during that period. She contacted the Newstead Historical Society, a volunteer-run organization operating out of a former schoolhouse. The elderly archivist, a woman named Agnes, was initially skeptical of Evelyn's unusual request, but warmed when she saw the photograph. Agnes pointed her to some poorly catalogued boxes containing the records of the local chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a powerful national organization, but, while primarily focused on temperance, often served as a veiled front for broader women's rights advocacy and a pathway for women to enter public life. A few names appeared repeatedly in the WCTU meeting minutes, spanning years of meticulous, if sometimes illegible, handwriting. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Albright, and curiously, a Mrs. Binns, noted as a lively speaker and a proponent of broader societal reforms. The handwritten notes sometimes included exclamation marks next to her name, suggesting a forceful personality. This was it, a concreted link. Miss Eve Spence, the initial, the surname, Newstead. It felt like finding a beacon in a dense fog, a sudden, blinding flash of light that illuminated her path. Evelyn's heart hammered with excitement. She immediately cross-referenced this Miss Evans with the census records again, this time with a more precise target and a specific town. She found Eleanor Vance, aged 27 in 1890, living with her widowed mother, Martha Vance. Her occupation was listed simply as none, a common entry for women who did not work outside the home. But in Eleanor's case, Evelyn suspected it belied a much more active, albeit unpaid, public life. The woman in the photograph was clearly not idle. The next step was to visit Newstead. It was a long drive from her university, a journey Evelyn had to the quiet, almost forgotten town since her brief research trip years ago for her dissertation, which had focused on industrial labor disputes. She booked a room in the only remaining bed and breakfast. The Old Mill Inn, a charming but somewhat creaky relic of its industrial past. She packed her research notes, the precious photograph, and a sense of determined anticipation. The echoes of Eleanor Vance were growing louder, drawing Evelyn into the silent history of a woman who refused to stay forgotten. Newstead awaited, holding secrets that were a century overdue for revelation, and Evelyn was ready to uncover them. Newstead was even quieter than Evelyn remembered. The main street, once bustling with mill workers and the clatter of horse-drawn carts, was now home to a handful of struggling businesses, a general store, a diner, a post office, and numerous empty storefronts with dusty windows. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. A quiet melancholy permeating the forgotten town. Her first stop was the Newstead Public Library, a small, unassuming brick building that housed the town's modest local history collection, surprisingly well kept despite the town's decline. The librarian, a kindly woman named Miss Gable, with silver hair and a pertole smile, was delighted to have a visitor, especially one interested in Newstead's past. "Not many folks come looking for our history these days," she remarked, her eyes twinkling. Evelyn explained their research, carefully omitting the shocking aspect or the exact nature of the photograph, and focused on the WCTU and women's activities in the late 19th century. Gable, with surprising alacrity, produced several dusty scrapbooks and ledger books from a back room, their covers worn smooth with age. "These have been sitting here for years," she said, "waiting for someone like you." Among the brittle pages, Evelyn found further confirmation of Eleanor Bence's profound involvement with the WCTU. She wasn't just a member, she was a prominent, often provocative voice. Minutes from meetings in 1889, frequently noted Miss Bence's passionate arguments and her unwavering commitment to the cause of social justice. One entry, dated July 1890, reported her audacious speech on the moral imperative of female suffrage, delivered to a rather sparse but engaged crowd at the town hall. This was significant. While the WCTU was a common entry point for women into public life, explicitly advocating for suffrage within its ranks was still considered quite radical, especially in a conservative and rural town like Newstead, where traditional gender roles were deeply entrenched. Eleanor was clearly pushing boundaries. Evelyn also found references to a short-lived local publication, the Newstead Reformer, which ran for only 2 years. It was an independent, progressive paper, a stark contrast to the staid, often conservative Newstead Chronicle. Flipping through the few surviving copies, which Mrs. Gable had carefully preserved, Evelyn's eyes widened. The Newstead Reformer regularly published cutting-edge articles on labor rights, temperance, social welfare, and most importantly, women's suffrage. Many of these articles were unsigned or attributed to pseudonyms like A Daughter of Liberty or Veritas, common practices for radical writers seeking to avoid backlash. Then, a small, faded notice in the December 1890 issue of the Reformer caught her eye. It was an advertisement for a local photographer, Miss Eliza Harding, portraits and tintypes, specializing in candid captures. No, 14 Mill Street. The address listed was just 2 blocks from where the Vance family home would have been. This was it. This was almost certainly the photographer of Evelyn's mysterious image. The phrase "candid captures" resonated deeply. It explained the unusual, direct and unposed nature of Eleanor's photograph. Eliza Harding was an artist who saw beyond the practiced smile, who captured something more authentic. It was a rare artistic sensibility for the time. Digging deeper into the Reformer, Evelyn discovered a series of powerful, unsigned editorials advocating for a woman's right to vote, to own property, and to pursue education and professions. The language was fiery, intellectual, deeply moving, and remarkably prescient for its time. Could these be Eleanor's words? The style, the conviction, the depth of argument aligned perfectly with the fierce intelligence Evelyn perceived in the photograph and the WCTU. Her suspicion was confirmed when she found a letter to the editor in the final issue of the Newstead Reformer, September 1891, written by a concerned citizen from a neighboring town, clearly dismayed by the paper's abrupt cessation. It lauded the paper's courageous and specifically praised the brilliant and challenging pieces penned by Miss Evans, whose voice will be sorely missed from these pages and from our public discourse. The letter ended with a cryptic, chilling note. Her departure leaves a void, and a silence that speaks volumes regarding the forces at play in our community. Departure, void, silence. Evelyn's exhilaration was tempered by a sudden chill, a creeping sense of dread. This wasn't just a forgotten activist. Something significant, something ominous had happened to Eleanor Vance. The shocking aspect wasn't just Eleanor's defiance. It was the sudden, complete disappearance of her voice from public record and the ominous tone of the letter. Why did the Reformer cease publication shortly after this mention? What departure? Why the silence that speaks volumes? The phrase echoed in Evelyn's mind, taking on a more sinister meaning. Evelyn turned to the town records for the early 1890s, specifically property transfers and death certificates, hoping to trace Eleanor's fate. There was no death certificate for Eleanor Vance in Newstead. Her mother Martha passed away peacefully, but in 1892, the Vance family home was sold. The records showed Eleanor Vance, as the sole heir after her mother's death, had formally signed over her share of the property to her cousin, a distant relative named Arthur Vance from Albany, and then no marriage record, no subsequent census entry, no burial plot. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist, vanished into thin air. The deeper Evelyn dug, the more Eleanor's story became one not just of activism, but of a rush. There was a palpable sense of someone being deliberately removed from the public eye, systematically scrubbed from the local narrative. The defiant gaze in the photograph took on a new, more poignant meaning. It wasn't just a challenge to the camera, it was a desperate, silent scream against the forces that would soon attempt to silence her forever. Evelyn felt an urgent need to uncover what happened between the moment that photograph was taken, in which the threads were unraveling, revealing a pattern of suppression and control that chilled her to the bone. The silence surrounding Eleanor Vance's disappearance was deafening, a vacuum where a vibrant life once existed. After leaving Newstead with more unsettling questions than answers, Evelyn returned to her academic network, hoping for a breakthrough. Her conversations with Mrs. Gable and the faded newspaper clippings had only deepened the mystery, transforming it from a historical puzzle into a profound human tragedy in the making. She reached out to colleagues specializing in legal history and social control in the late 90s. When contact Professor Alan Finch, a renowned legal historian at Columbia University, suggested looking into the pervasive morality clauses prevalent in contracts and social agreements of the era, particularly those affecting women. He also advised her to research the various institutions that served as custodians for troublesome women. Evelyn found a breakthrough in the digitized archives of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. In their vast correspondence files, among letters from prominent figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she stumbled upon a brief, coded letter from a sympathizer in Newstead, dated October. The language was deliberately vague, yet the underlying distress was palpable. The letter mentioned a tragic silencing and the unfortunate situation of our brave Eleanor Riddoff, alluded to pressures from powerful families and the threat of institutionalization for unbecoming behavior and radical views. The words hung in the air, cold and menacing. Institutionalization. The word sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine, far colder than the autumn air outside her window. In the late mid-18th century, madness or hysteria was a convenient and horrifyingly effective label applied to women who defied societal expectations, who dared to step outside the narrow confines of their prescribed roles. A woman could be committed to an asylum for anything from hysteria to independent thought, from expressing political opinions to simply being deemed too excitably often on the sole word of a male relative, a husband, father, or cousin. It was a powerful tool of social control, a legal mechanism to silence and erase those who threatened the patriarchal order, to remove them from public life without recourse. Evelyn immediately shifted her research to asylum records for New York. This was a challenging task, as many records were private, poorly preserved, or deliberately destroyed to protect family reputations. However, through persistent requests and the invaluable assistance of a contact in the state archives, a sympathetic archivist who understood the historical significance of such records, she gained access to a partial index of admissions to the Wheeler Asylum for the Chronic Insane, a notorious and sprawling institution operating at the time, known for its long-term residents, and there it was. Her breath hitched. The name leaped off the page, stark and devastating. Name, Eleanor Vance. Admission date, September 21. Diagnosed condition, moral insanity, undue excitement regarding political matters, unwomanly conduct, tendencies towards public agitation. Admitting authority, Arthur Vance, Cousin, Albal, N.A.W. The shocking element of Eleanor's story revealed its devastating, brutal truth. She hadn't simply left Newstead. She had been forcibly committed, her freedom stolen, her identity erased. Her cousin Arthur Vance was not merely taking over the family property after her mother's death. He was the instrument of her confinement, the legal hand that sealed her fate. Moral insanity was a chillingly flexible, catch-all diagnosis often used to suppress political dissent or social nonconformity in women. Undue excitement regarding political matters was a clear, damning indictment of her suffrage activism, her passionate editorials, and her public speeches. Unwomanly conduct encompassed her independent thought and her very public presence, her refusal to be invisible. Evelyn felt a surge of rage, cold and furious, bubbling up from deep within her. The vibrant, defiant woman from the photograph, so full of life and conviction, had been locked away, her voice silenced, her spirit systematically broken, her very existence redefined as a mental illness. This was the ultimate erasure, a deliberate, calculated act to quash a powerful spirit. The Newstead letter's silence that speaks volumes was chillingly literal, a prophecy fulfilled. Further investigation into Arthur Vance, through legal directories and local histories of Albany, revealed he was a conservative Albany lawyer with significant social and political connections, a man who valued order and reputation above all else. It became clear that Eleanor's activism, her outspoken Achilles in The Reformer, and her audacious challenge to the traditional roles of women in conservative Newstead had become too inconvenient, too embarrassing for the family, perhaps even financially threatening to their standing in the community. Her widowed mother, Martha, might have been unable or unwilling to protect her, perhaps even coerced into complicity under intense family or societal pressure. The pressure to conform, to maintain appearances, was immense in that era. Evelyn found a brief, almost buried notice in the Newstead Chronicle from late September 21, the same week as Eleanor's commitment, mentioning the sudden illness of Miss Evans, requiring her removal for specialized care outside of Newstead. It was a thinly veiled euphemism, designed to maintain appearances, to whitewash the truth, and to bury the scandal. The town, it seemed, was only too eager to forget its inconvenient activist. The photograph of Eleanor, with her direct, unyielding gaze, now seemed to Evelyn like a final act of rebellion, a last defiant statement, captured before her spirit was systematically broken. She was looking out, not just at the camera, but perhaps directly at the future, pleading for someone to understand, to remember, to rescue her. The image was no longer just a historic curiosity. It was a potent testament to the brutal suppression faced by women who dared to challenge the status quo. Evelyn understood, with a profound clarity, the immense responsibility She now bore to tell Eleanor's full, tragic story. The price of defiance for Eleanor Vance had been her freedom and her very identity, a sacrifice that demanded recognition. The discovery of Eleanor's forced institutionalization left Evelyn reeling, a raw wound on her historian's heart. The archival records provided a chilling, unequivocal clarity to shocking aspect of her story. Her disappearance wasn't voluntary. It was a deliberate, cruel act of social control, burying a vibrant intellect and a passionate advocate within the forbidding walls of an asylum. But in the records also raised new questions, like ghostly whispers in the archives. How long was she there? Did she ever get out? Did she have any descendants who might carry a fragment of her truth, a genetic memory of her defiance? Evelyn delved deeper into the Wheeler Asylum record. Patient files from that era were often sparse and dehumanizing, focusing on diagnosis and treatments rather than individual narratives, reducing complex lives to medical shorthand. However, after extensive cross-referencing and navigating labyrinthine bureaucratic systems, she eventually found a follow-up entry for Eleanor Vance. Date: June 2. Status update: patient Eleanor Vance, condition stable, remains confined due to persistent radical tendencies and lack of suitable family to assume guardianship. Transferred to the care of cousin Arthur Vance for perpetual guardianship and maintenance at family expense due to change in institutional policy. This was a devastating blow, a fresh wave of sorrow. Eleanor had spent at least 12 years, perhaps more, confined within the bleak walls of Wheeler. The notation transferred to the care of cousin Arthur Vance for perpetual guardianship was particularly insidious. It meant she wasn't released to live freely, to reclaim her life. She was merely moved from one form of confinement, the asylum, to another, under the legal absolute control of the very person who had committed her. This was a common, though grim practice of the era, often used when families wanted to control an inconvenient relative without the full stigma and cost of public institutionalization. It allowed Arthur Vance to maintain absolute control over Eleanor and her small inheritance, ensuring her continued silence and removal from any public life. She was, in essence, a prisoner within a gilded cage. Evelyn immediately tried to trace Arthur Vance, his lineage, hoping to find living descendants who might have inherited family papers, old photographs, or at least an oral history, however fragmented or distorted. It was a painstaking genealogical hunt, relying on census records, obituaries, and online family trees. She found that Arthur had married late and had one son, Thomas. Thomas had several children, and one of them, a granddaughter named Caroline Vance Miller, was still living in upstate New York, not far from Albany. Now in her late 80s, hesitantly Evelyn reached out to Caroline, composing a careful letter that explained her historical research and her interest in the Vance family's history, focusing initially on Eleanor's known activities. She deliberately omitted the specifics of Eleanor's institutionalization at first, wanting to build trust before dropping such a shocking revelation. Caroline, initially wary of a stranger inquiring about her family, eventually, after several phone calls, agreed to meet. She confessed a vague curiosity about her family's past, which had always been shrouded in a certain decorum and unspoken rules. Their meeting took place in a quiet cafe in a small town outside Albany, far from the bustling university. Caroline, a sharp-witted woman with keen eyes that missed little, listened intently as Evelyn laid out what she knew of Eleanor's early life and activism, presenting the striking photograph as the starting point of her quest. Caroline gasped softly when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Eleanor Vance," she murmured, pressing the image with a trembling finger, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "My grandmother, Arthur's wife, used to speak of her sometimes, always in hushed tones, almost a whisper. 'Poor Eleanor,' she'd say. 'She had such ideas.'" Caroline paused, collecting her thoughts. She was always just Aunt Eleanor to us, even though she was a cousin. She lived in a quiet corner of the house, We were told she'd had a nervous collapse in her youth and was never quite right after that. They tried to keep her comfortable, but she was distant. She never spoke of politics or anything like that. Just read her books, mostly. Evelyn gently, carefully, introduced the details she'd found in the asylum records. Caroline's face blanched, the color draining from her cheeks. Institutionalized. For abuse? My grandfather did that. The revelation was clearly shocking to her, shattering a carefully constructed family myth. The sanitized family narrative of nervous collapse crumbled under the stark, brutal weight of historical truth. Caroline admitted there were no letters or diaries from Eleanor herself, no personal mementos that had survived, a testament to how thoroughly her voice had been suppressed and her personal history erased, even within her own family. The family had diligently scrubbed away any evidence of her true struggle. She died in their house in Maintostente. Caroline concluded, her voice barely a whisper, still processing the immense betrayal. Buried in the family plot, but her gravestone is very small, tucked away almost hidden. Just her name and dates. Like an afterthought. A quiet footnote to a life they wished to forget. Eleanor Vance, the defiant woman whose gaze could pierce a century, who dared to speak out for justice, had lived out her days under the watchful, controlling eye of her captor, her spirit broken, her voice silenced, until her quiet, unremarkable death. The photograph, taken in 1890, captured the peak of her spirit, a fleeting moment of defiant vitality and intellectual fire before the long, dark years of erasure and imprisonment. The legacy was heartbreaking. Eleanor had been a prisoner of her own family, the immense price of her progressive ideals, paid in years of lost freedom and a life lived in silent subjugation. Evelyn felt a profound sorrow for Eleanor, a sense of grief for a life stolen, but also a renewed, fierce sense of purpose. Her silence, as the Newstead letter had predicted, truly spoke volumes. It was a testament to the immense power structures Eleanor had dared to challenge, and the chilling lengths to which they would go to maintain control and crush dissent. Evelyn now possessed the complete, shocking story as the forgotten woman, and she knew she had to bring it to light, not just for academic curiosity, but as an act of justice for Eleanor. Armed with the full, devastating narrative of Eleanor Vance, a narrative of painstakingly pieced together from fragments and whispers across a century, Evelyn felt a profound weight of responsibility. Her goal was no longer merely to identify the woman in the photograph, but to resurrect her, to give voice to a life deliberately silenced, to shout her truth from the rooftops. Eleanor Vance had been systematically erased from public memory, relegated to a euphemistic nervous collapse in family lore, but her truth, once uncovered, was a powerful stinging indictment of the era's brutal suppression of female autonomy and intellectual freedom. Evelyn completed her research with meticulous care, spending countless late nights synthesizing her findings. She integrated the fragile archive records from Newstead, the daring suffrage correspondence, the chilling asylum admissions, and Caroline Vance Miller's poignant family anecdotes. Each piece of evidence was a thread, weaving together a tapestry of courage and betrayal. The photograph, once a mere object of curiosity, a haunting image plucked from obscurity, now served as the anchor for the entire story, a vivid visual testament to Eleanor's vibrant spirit before its tragic eclipse. It was a defiant portrait that predated her suppression, a precious glimpse of the woman she truly was. And the first step was to write an article for a respected historical journal, the Journal of American Women's History, a publication known for its rigorous scholarship and commitment to uncovering hidden narratives. The article, titled The Unflinching Gaze, The Silencing of Eleanor Vance, Newstead Suffragist, detailed Evelyn's painstaking detective work, the broader historical context of moral insanity, the analgesis for women, and the specific, cruel circumstances of Eleanor's confinement. It positioned Eleanor not as a passive victim of fate, but as a courageous figure whose very existence, whose potent beliefs and public expressions were perceived as so threatening to the established order that extraordinary illegal measures were taken to quell her. The academic community needed to know the systematic nature of this oppression. The article was met with significant scholarly interest, generating lively discussions and even debate within academic circles. It ignited crucial conversations about the hidden histories of women who challenged the status quo and the systematic, insidious ways their contributions and their very identities were often erased from the official record. Inspired by the overwhelmingly positive reception and the realization that Eleanor's story resonated far beyond her niche, Evelyn decided to expand her series into a full-length book, aiming for a broader non-academic audience. She wanted Eleanor's story to reach the public, to resonate with contemporary readers, to highlight the enduring relevance of fighting for fundamental rights and the profound dangers of allowing powerful narratives to dictate historical truth. For the book, Evelyn returned to Newstead. This time, she didn't search for dusty records. She walked the streets Eleanor would have known, imagining her footsteps, her thoughts. She visited the site where the Baines family home once stood, now a vacant lot overgrown with tenacious weeds and memories. She stood outside the old town hall, now a crumbling community center, imagining Eleanor delivering her impassioned, courageous speech on suffrage, her voice ringing out despite the odds. She even sought out the descendants of Eliza Harding, the brave photographer, hoping to find more of her candid captures, or perhaps even a record of her portrait studio, though her search yielded no further images of Eleanor or definitive details about Eliza's fate. It seemed both women, in their own ways, had defied conventions and paid a price for it. As Evelyn stood in the quiet, wind-swept cemetery beside Eleanor's tiny, unassuming gravestone, she placed a single white rose, a symbol of remembrance and purity of purpose. The inscription was indeed brief, almost an afterthought. Eleanor Vance, 1863, but for Evelyn, that small, almost forgotten stone now held the immense weight of a monumental struggle, a hidden testament to a life lived bravely and then cruelly stifled. The book, definitively titled The Unforgotten Gaze, Eleanor Vance and the Silence of Women. Evelyn decided to lead with the photograph, making Eleanor's powerful image the central motif, the visual heart of the narrative. She aimed to weave Eleanor's personal tragedy into the broader, sweeping tapestry of the women's suffrage movement, showcasing the individual sacrifices made for collective progress, the unseen battles fought in quiet towns. She emphasized that Eleanor's story was not an isolated incident, a mere anomaly, but a chilling and deeply human example of the systemic oppression faced by women who dared to think, speak, and act independently in a society that sought to control them. In the final chapter of her book, Evelyn planned to reflect on the ongoing importance of historical retrieval, of seeking out the hidden narratives and challenging the dominant historical record, which too often favors the powerful. She would argue that reclaiming voices like Eleanor Vance's was not just an act of academic exercise, a dry historical pursuit, but a vital, moral imperative in understanding the present and shaping a more equitable future. The photograph that had first captivated her in the dusty antique shop had become more than just an image. It was a portal to a forgotten past, a searing testament to resilience and a rallying cry for remembrance. Evelyn looked at the printed photograph of Eleanor Vance, now framed and displayed prominently in her office, illuminated by the desk lamp. The woman's eyes still held that unwavering intensity, that silent challenge, that quiet fire. But now Evelyn knew her gaze was no longer just a desperate plea for recognition. It was a triumph. Through Evelyn's tireless efforts, through her commitment to the truth, Eleanor Vance's voice, though silenced for over a century, was finally being heard, echoing across time, ensuring that she would be forgotten no more. The shocking photo had led to a shocking truth, and from that truth, a powerful, vital voice had been reclaimed.